Okay, I think we're all here. So good morning, everyone, and thank you for getting up early this morning to come in hear about the budget. Welcome to Cavendish's post-budget breakfast briefing. Just a warning that the event is being filmed, so yeah, you can watch it back later if you want to. For those of you who haven't met me, my name is Emma Barnes. I'm an Associate Director here at Cavendish. I joined Cavendish only 6 weeks ago, so I'm super new, but I joined Cavendish from the Labour Party, where I was a Senior Political Advisor to Jonathan Ashworth, who was a member of the Shadow Cabinet. So no surprises what I think of the budget, perhaps. So it's been a big week in politics, and probably the most important week since the general election. The first female Chancellor delivered Labour's first budget in 14 years. The budget has come 4 months into Labour's time in office. It's been a time where Labour have set to define themselves by their political inheritance and how bad they found the public finances. And Rachel Reeves took the opportunity yesterday to set out how she thought she could make the country a better place. Rachel set out huge plans for infrastructure investment, including HS2 spending. She's set out Labour's core focus, which she says is investing in public services in order to drive growth. There's been some, questions as to whether or not she'll achieve the growth she wants to, and hopefully our panel will discuss that in a moment. So our fantastic panel are Patrick English. Patrick is Director of Political Analytics at YouGov and YouGov's spokesperson on political research. Patrick is responsible for election modelling and forecasting across YouGov's European markets and leads on research and development. Katy Balls. Katy is the Spectator's political editor and has made a name for herself through her insightful columns on the ins and outs of Westminster. She's a regular columnist for The Eye and hosts her own Spectator podcast, Women with Balls, where she speaks to women leading the way in their fields. And finally, Chris Curtis MP. Chris is the Labour Member of Parliament for Milton Keynes North and was elected in July 2024. Prior to being elected, Chris worked in polling, and he's a member of the Housing, Communities and Local Government Select Committee and a leading member of the Labour Growth Group and the Labour YIMBY movement. So, to begin, I'm going to hand over to our panel for some opening thoughts. We'll then have a bit of a discussion, and there'll be time at the end for questions. So, to kick us off, we've got Patrick.
Yes, good morning. Thank you for having me. I always feel a bit cheeky coming to these sort of snap reaction events and eating the croissants and having the coffee, because while my sort of esteemed colleagues, Katy and Chris, can sort of talk about their hottest takes and their best goss, as a pollster, I basically have to sit here and go, dunno, yet. So unless something in a budget or a political event is really going to cut through straight to, let's be frank, people's back pockets, sort of as pollsters, we won't tend to do snap polling of things like the budget. It's one thing perhaps if there's going to be a personal tax increase or a cut or some sort of big announcement that's really going to resonate with people straight away. But a lot of what we saw in the budget yesterday was quite technical and angled sort of specifically in a way that was designed to not make it sound like the average person was going to pay or be affected. So it'll be in the days to come, really, where we're going to start to see how the public is receiving this budget. Now, of course, the vast majority of people had far better things to do with their day yesterday than sit and listen to Rachel Reeves at the dispatch box for 90 minutes. We all did. Absolutely, but most people didn't. However...
That's my pen.
That's a very well-timed drop of the pen. However, we did a bit of polling on Monday. As we normally do, we do this twice a week now with our new sort of AI tool that's able to tell us what people are thinking about and talking about in their own words. We asked them what stories they've been noticing most over the past few days, and around about a third of Brits said it was the budget that they'd heard the most about. Now, not many things reach 1/3 of the public saying that this is the thing I've heard most about. So I think we should expect over the next coming days to get some real sort of strong reaction to this and some real reaction to how people are consuming this and how people are thinking about this. And in that way, I believe there are two games in town as far as the Labour Party are concerned. One is whether or not they can land an idea or land the suggestion that this was a budget about getting more money into public services. fixing what they sort of have inherited and moving Britain onto a better place. Or two, which will be the kind of exact opposite of what they want, which is this is a budget about raising taxes and working people are going to pay. And what we're going to see now, I think, is going to be an aerial war, a big sort of conflict between trying to land those two narratives between Labour and the opposition and the ecosystems around both. And which one cuts through most of the public, I think, is going to largely determine how they view this budget, whether they think it's fair, whether they're optimistic about it, whether they expect it to be a success. And it's a really important early marker, I think, on the Labour government on the part of the court of public opinion.
Thanks. Katy?
Yeah, I think we're picking up on that. It's a budget we heard so much about before it happened. And you saw that in the sense that the Speaker was not particularly thrilled. His deputy was also not very thrilled. We have very tight deadlines at the Spectator. We go to press at 1:30 p.m. on a Wednesday. So you can probably imagine how relaxing it is on budget day. And we push... Is my microphone stopped? No, it's fine. Okay, great. And we push it to 2 p.m. on budget day, just so we have a little bit of time to take out anything that is egregiously wrong in the magazine. But as I think Nisgani was really going for Rachel Reeves, giving quite like a bollocking, one could say, before the budget started, I was like, this is obviously very important to parliamentary scrutiny, but we do need to keep the show on the road. And Rachel Reeves did also speak longer than the average Chancellor, so she finished 5 minutes before we had to go to press. But I think the fact that you had so many measures thrown out to the press, some of which was journalists doing their jobs and doing digging, some of which was a purposeful move from the Treasury, I think spoke to some of the nervousness about this budget. It's partly linked to Liz Truss and the mini-budget. I think we're so past the point where having a bunny and a fiscal surprise is seen as a good thing, or something that's worth the risk, the thrill of the public or the journalists having something to say, and instead you're much more worried about the market reaction. So we know that Rachel Reeves wanted to purposely pitch roll the change in the fiscal rules on infrastructure. You still saw yesterday borrowing costs going up. It was nothing like the response to Liz Truss's mini-budget, to be very clear. But I think we've still got a bit of a cool reaction, and we're not going to have a clear enough sense of that, for a few days a week. And it meant there weren't many surprises in that budget. The thing I thought was probably the biggest surprise to me was not so much the measures in it, but it seemed to me there was a clearer messaging around it than lots of the messaging before. So we've had obviously endless fun working out what a working person is or isn't in recent weeks. But I think that Rachel Reeves had quite a coherent narrative on, the political choices this Labour government has chosen to make. You combine the decisions on things like employer national insurance, trying to preserve, not freezing. There are clearly a few things that were floated near the end just so they had something that they weren't doing to cheer people up. So I never thought they would do 5p on fuel duty, because I just think very brave, as a civil servant might say. And similarly, not freezing the thresholds for longer than planned. But I think you link up the things she was saying, and you can say that Rachel Reeves is keeping certain promises to working people. You look at Labour's working rights package, that is a coherent narrative. They are taxing businesses and they are taxing the wealthy, and the Labour government isn't particularly embarrassed about it. I think they're quite keen to land that. Where I think potentially the sting comes in the tail is you look at the OBR growth forecasts. You also just think a bit down the line. You have the OBR pointing out the cons of these tax rises, and that really big tax rise, which is the national insurance employer. Well, you can already see from the OBR analysis that it starts to affect the employee, and numbers potentially coming out of the labour market. You also look at that, that's one of the projections. And I think when it comes to some of the small businesses and that rise in the national living wage, are you going to end up at a point where some small firms are employing fewer people, and perhaps those who are in the workplace are feeling as though they're taking more home, but there are few people doing that? And then are we going to have some of those lowest paid jobs almost disappearing? So I think it's a budget where both in terms of Rachel Reeves' claims to have growth as the #1 priority, I think you can ask a few questions about, well, this is going to do that. And if you were going to do it, would this not be the budget to do it? And then secondly, I think that the worker message probably lands in the immediate, but in the medium to long term, there could be some issues. And I know Chris is going to talk all about infrastructure, or at least considerably, and growth, so I'm going to leave that to him for now.
Thanks, Katy. Chris?
Yes, thank you. Thank you for inviting me along as well, Emma. It's great to be here, even if it's slightly too early for me. Look, I lose the whip unless I spend at least 30 seconds talking about the inheritance, so I'm going to do that quickly. I spent a lot of time in this job being incredibly envious of my predecessors. If you think about when Labour came to power in 1997, they inherited an economy that was growing and doing all right, and public finances in a good place, but public services that were completely broken. And that Labour government came into place in order to fix it. When you think about the Tories coming in 2010, you had public services working, highest NHS satisfaction, but after that financial crisis, there was an economic gap that needed to be closed. In fact, we've got worse than both of those situations. We've got public services worse than 97. We've got a financial situation that's worse than 2010, and this is the budget that has to wrestle with that backdrop. And I think given that pretty hideous backdrop that we've had to deal with, the budget yesterday was about as good as it's possible to get. I think Rachel did a really incredible job at working out how we take the country from the place it currently is and think about the brighter future that we know Britain needs. Broadly speaking, what do I think it did? Well, most important job is it needed to get the books balanced, closing down that £22 billion black hole that was left to us by the Tories, but also actually the number's really a lot bigger than that because they were projecting massive spending cuts. They were assuming that they were going to do massive spending cuts without really saying how they were going to do them in the future, and we needed to wrestle with that as an issue. Secondly, we needed to make sure that it fixed the biggest problems that have been facing our public services, most notably the NHS. And there is considerably more money for the NHS in this budget. Some of the biggest increases in NHS spending we've ever seen, and God knows we need it. Now, that extra spending obviously needs to come alongside reform as well. Wes is obsessed with this, thinking about how we use technology in order to get our NHS running more efficiently, using data to get our NHS running more efficiently, focusing more on prevention. But the NHS is devastating at the moment. It's holding back our economy, it's holding back our country. So making sure that we get that fixed, alongside some of those other big problems that are facing our public services. There was extra money yesterday for SEND education. Anybody that's got kids, or spoken to anyone that's got kids, or spoken to anybody who works anywhere near education, or local authorities, knows how devastating SEND education is in this country. We put extra money in order to help fix it. So getting the books balanced, given what we were left, fixing the biggest problems facing our public services, and obviously having to make those really difficult decisions on tax rises in order to do both of those things at the same time. And I think, no tax rise is ever good. None of us ever come into politics to do tax rises. But the tax rises that we've done are fair, balanced. Most people I speak to, including those that are affected, get the fact that we need to do them, and don't think that they're overburdensome, albeit with some problems, with some difficulties that will inevitably come about from that. But I think the most important thing that we're focusing on the budget is starting to turn the tide on economic growth. For the last 14 years, basically the median person in this country has the same wage as they did before the financial crisis, maybe a tad higher. If we have 14 more years of that as a country, we're in deep trouble. I have no idea how we keep our NHS going. I have no idea how we keep an inflation-linked pension in those circumstances. I have no idea how we keep, to be honest with you, centrist liberal democracy if we have 14 more years of basically no economic growth like we've had over the last 14 years. So getting economic growth back is the most important task. The trajectory on growth that we were left by the last government, not just that they failed to achieve it, but the trajectory that we were left was also pretty dismal. It was also at least another 5 years of most people in this country not seeing more money into their wage packets. We've got to turn that around. I think there were lots of things in the budget that helped us turn that around. More money for housing, more money for infrastructure, getting HS2 across the line, also East-West Rail. Across that Oxford-Cambridge corridor, which is incredibly important growth region for this country. There is billions and billions of pounds that people want to start investing into Oxford and Cambridge. We've also seen more money for planners, and also the changes to the fiscal rules. The fiscal rules basically acted to work against growth because they stopped you from investing in things that can crowd in private sector investment and get our economy growing. We've changed that debt rule so that it prioritises bringing economic growth back. So there's lots and lots of things in there that can help us start that journey of bringing growth back to our economy. But what I will say is that's not going to happen through one event. We know that it needs to be a constant task for us as a government, as politicians, in order to do everything that we can in order to bring growth back for our economy. That's why we created the Labour Growth Group, because we know that this is the most important mission, because it's only by getting those productivity gains, getting investment back into our economy, getting more wages into the pay packets of people across this country, that we can turn around our economy, our public services, after the 14 years of damage that we've seen.
Thanks, Chris. I think, you raised some interesting points that you all touched on about investment. Are Labour spending the money in the right places? Is this what the voters need to see, what businesses need to see? Patrick, do you want to kick us off?
Ooh, that's a tough question for a pollster. I think in a typical political way, I'll frame the question in a way that sort of I can speak to with the data I've got. And in terms of where the public want to see money spent is on public services. That's where they really, really, really want it to be going, and in particular to the NHS. And I think there was a poignant move and a poignant sort of a very particular and a deliberate framing of that in the speech that Rachel Reeves gave yesterday, in trying to kind of hammer home this idea or this point that the money that was being raised, a lot of it was to go toward paying for public services, and with specific mentions to the NHS and to the education budget as well. Now, as Chris will know from the polling that we actually did with Labour Together and the sort of Labour Growth Group more generally, people are willing to put even more of their own tax money into a pot which goes specifically to the NHS. It's one of these rare occasions in polling where we actually find people saying, do you know what? Fine, take more money off my wages. If it's going there, I'm pretty happy with it. So insofar as the budget is doing that, and insofar as there were sort of specific pots going into sort of the public service arena, I think it's going into the right place as far as the public are concerned.
Katy?
Yeah, I mean, I'll play slight devil's advocate, which is just, I think that if you ask people, would they like the NHS to work better, and say, would you pay more of your taxes, then most would say yes. Mm-hmm. The question is, after you put over 20 billion in the NHS, is the NHS going to feel different? Is it going to feel in a way that your average voter feels as though they're getting more access? Is the waiting list now just going to be so many week wait compared to the other one? And is that going to be something where there is gratitude? And I think for as much as we're streeting, and he does love to talk about NHS reform, before and now in government, we so far have not that much of a sense of what exactly they're going to do on it. And yes, technology, and I do think some of the things and some of the appointments, like Alan Milburn and others, is encouraging in terms of the NHS reform. But we have also just had an online survey asking the public what they think on NHS reform, which included things such as a maximum BMI for nurses. Which I know was more saying, let's start a national conversation. Clearly they're not going to take that one too seriously. But I don't think we're yet at a point where you have the clear reform and you don't have the NHS committing to certain outcomes in return for this cash. So I think the politics of this budget are quite smart, which is, on paper, I think that you can definitely land the message, which is businesses are paying more in tax, it's going on the NHS and public services, and Rachel Reeves is out this morning doing that, so I totally agree on that point. I think the risk is not so much how they're pitching it, is whether any of it works. Because if it doesn't, then I think you're going to run into some serious problems. And it's notable that you have Rachel Reeves, which, not ruling out future tax rises, which I don't think is because that is the current plan. And most chancellors don't want to box themselves in. I think lots of Labour politicians with the gift of hindsight worry they box themselves in a little bit too much in that election campaign, as it is. I think the danger of this budget is not so much how they can sell it in the immediate. It is just look at what the OBR is saying on growth, and let's question whether this money is going to lead to a sense of people feel they have better public services. Because I think there are differences with Blair and Brown. I think there was more of a sense of reform and how you're going to get there with the things you were doing that was at least visible to the public.
Can I very quickly, just because that's such a good point, and there's a little bit of polling we have that can speak to that, and if you sort of ask the public, well, if an NHS is improving or if you see a better NHS, what really does that look like? And the key signal that always comes through is waiting lists. And that's the real thing that they're going to hang sort of the success of NHS improvement on, I think. So in terms of the public, at least, there's a signal there, and it's that. And so I guess the question becomes, OK, does that money lead to falling waiting lists, lead to the public looking at the NHS and going, yeah, that's improved?
Chris, can I move the investment onto talking about infrastructure and house building? I know that those are two issues that you're very passionate about.
Yeah.
Do you think Rachel is going to get to the next election having achieved the aims that she set out on infrastructure investment and on building the number of houses she says she will?
Well, I mean, I'll do housing first, because I think, you know, I did the bit on the inheritance, but I'm also not sure that people quite realise the complete mess that the housing and construction industry is in at the moment. I mean, most SME house builders are really either gone out of business or completely on the brink. You've got people making the various products that are required for infrastructure or housing, looking at closing down at the moment, not expanding. And we need to shift that around incredibly quickly. So this extra injection of cash, and it's a lot of cash, it's 5 billion quid into housing in order to look at how we can unlock housing, particularly affordable housing, is a significant chunk of money in order to turn around what is currently an industry which is on the brink and get it to one that is looking at how can it start investing in growing again. But this is one where it's not just money, actually. Like one of the biggest reasons why we've had a real lack of certainty in the industry is because our planning system has been a complete state. And the Tories have on occasion when they were in government, tried to look at changing it, and then they, lost a by-election in Chesham and Amersham and decided to completely U-turn. And the industry has lost faith on having that kind of certainty that there will be a pipeline for infrastructure for housing projects in the meantime, or will the government just buckle under pressure from NIMBYs? And I think it's really important that we as backbenchers, that we as a government make it clear that we will not buckle under that pressure. We know that bringing growth back to our economy is incredibly important. We know that building those 1.5 million homes for the next generation. I come from the generation that's been screwed by this housing crisis. I'm determined to make sure that we get those extra houses built. Being able to provide everybody in this room, if nobody else, with that certainty that we really mean this. We are going to support you in making sure that we get those houses built. If you go out there and start growing your businesses, we'll make sure that the planning permissions are coming through in order for you to be able to do them. And then the third element of this that's really important is the extra planners. I mean, I don't think there is one bottleneck on our economy bigger than our broken planning system in local authorities. We just have a dramatic shortage of planners. Decisions that should take 13 weeks are often taking years. I spoke to one business, it wasn't in housing, it was a supermarket chain, who we talk about bringing investment into the UK. They've got investment from their parent company, and they're handing 25% of it back to them every single year just because they can't get decisions from planning. That's one company handing tens of millions of pounds back that should be being invested in Britain. Multiply that out across the economy, and it's billions of pounds just because we haven't got enough planners in the system. So getting more planners into our system, alongside that extra money for housing, alongside providing everybody with that certainty that we really mean business on this, I think is incredibly important.
Katy, any thoughts on house building?
Well, I think just probably building on what Chris says, when it comes to, well, there's two parts. I mean, I think some of the infrastructure real changing is going to be, I think, we'll see what happens in the spending review, because obviously we now move into the comprehensive spending review due in the spring. But I think a lot of that is kind of looking at, things that are close to Ed Miliband's department. I think on the housing, we're expecting to hear more from Angela Rayner's department. There's been a bit of a question as to who's really in charge of the planning rules. Is it Rachel Reeves in the Treasury, or is it the Deputy Prime Minister? Angela Rayner's team say it's very much of Angela Rayner. And I think seeing how they plan to move in terms of what they're coming out with on the rules around certain parts of residential planning will be quite key on it. And then I think there's a question which is, you have Chris as a YIMBY group. So you mentioned Chesham and Amersham. I mean, there are some things that just change a little bit because the political landscape has changed. And one of those is, I think if you think about the makeup of the Labour Party, the Tories probably did just have more NIMBYs in. I think that you
Still do.
Yeah. But I think you probably have some NIMBYs. Have you discovered any yet?
I'm not dobbing them in.
What's your Chipping Norton Labour MP like?
Chipping Norton.
Are they YIMBY?
Dan?
Yeah.
Dan is the biggest
Yeah,
YIMBY.
exactly.
Dan's bigger YIMBY than me. Yeah, we've kicked out Theresa Villiers and we've got somebody that wants to actually get building in a really important part of the country.
So I think the very fact in places like Chipping Norton you have got the YIMBY, but I do wonder on the housing question, which is, as you start to get more of those local complaints, are some of the people, which is what happened in the Tory party, who initially said, yes, house building's great, it's going to help the economy, are they going to start to find the inner NIMBY? And perhaps they won't, because you have people like Chris in that group. But I think that would be one of the parliamentary pressure tests on it.
But the most significant group of backbench MPs under the last Tory government was the European Research Group, which was look at just basically creating chaos for whoever ran it and trying to create the most catastrophic form of Brexit possible. The most significant group of backbench Labour MPs under this government is the Labour Growth Group, that is trying to do, among many things, obviously get the economy growing, but also make sure that we mean business on making those planning changes that are necessary to get Britain building again. And there are so many of us that have been at that. You talk about Dan, he's one of them, that have really been at the brunt of the housing crisis. We have personally faced the consequences of it, or at the very least, we've got close friends who have really faced the consequences of it. We're knocking doors every weekend, speaking to people who are living in mouldy, old, awful accommodation. We're having to speak to our local councillors and talk about that, in my case, 1,000 families living in temporary accommodation. There is very few things more important to this government than housing. It's a big part of our top mission, so we really mean business on getting those houses built. This isn't something that we're going to find some political difficulties on in 2 years' time and change our mind on. We will do everything we can in order to unlock those 1.5 million homes that Britain needs.
Thanks, Chris. I wanted to just move the next part of the discussion onto the impact on businesses. Now, the national insurance rise is being absorbed by business, although the OBR say that some people will be feeling the impact in their pay slips. Is there a danger that Labour have set out a budget that will hit the smallest and the medium-sized businesses the most, and big businesses will be able to absorb the cost, and therefore they're not going to have the impact on growth, and Labour are no longer pro-business? Katy, would you say that's the case?
I think there's a risk on some of these things, right? You've already heard. I mean, I think Rachel Reeves did announce some support for small businesses within the budget to try and counter this, because it was clearly a criticism that was being levelled up before she had even spoken. But I think that clearly the smaller businesses already feel under strain, and you've also seen big warnings from the hospitality industry in this budget, and you also had, the CEO of Marks and Spencer's come out and say in advance, oh, you shouldn't raise these taxes and so forth. So I think there is potentially an issue which is going to be, and this is before you even get to some things such as, ending non-doms and so forth. I'm not trying to sound like a Spectator caricature here, but I just mean as in, there's obviously various measures that if you were going for some routes of growth, you would be, when Rachel Reeves would talk about, bankers' bonuses and how she wouldn't bring back the cap before the election, that was a certain tone which meant that business really felt they could work with Rachel Reeves. I think that she still is very respected, and is one of the reasons the markets haven't reacted so badly yet to some of the things she wants to do on borrowing. But I do think this budget is a move away from what business would want to see, and there is a risk that if things like reform of the public services don't work, and if the investment infrastructure isn't used in the ways which is really going to bring growth, because some of the things you might use it on might be things the UK needs but aren't going to lead to growth, then that does create an issue, because if the overall calculation doesn't work, at the end of the day, you're going to have a load of businesses that are being taxed more money, which feels as though they can employ fewer people. And where is the wealth creation there, given that Rachel Reeves has been speaking a lot about wealth creation? I think the jury is out on that one, but it's a clear risk of this budget.
Patrick?
Yeah, again, sort of couch it a little bit in terms of wider public opinion on this issue. If you ask the public who should be paying for this sort of stuff, or you sort of suggest the idea that things do need paying for and sort of, who is best placed to facilitate that payment, it's perhaps no surprise to anybody that the British public will say big businesses and wealthy individuals, essentially not me. However, if you stick the word small in front of businesses, it does get a little bit trickier. There is a sense among the British public that a small business is very different from a large business, and that small businesses shouldn't perhaps be shouldering the burden of the sort of things that need to be done, or that they would suggest needs doing in the British economy, sort of rebalance things, pay for public services, etc., etc., etc. So there is a political risk, certainly, for Labour if they're seen to be going hard after small businesses. It's kind of a little bit trickier ground than wealthier individuals, stuff like non-DOMs. All these taxes and all these changes are going to be pretty popular, I'm going to speculate, with the British public, because they address the sorts of people, or they're targeted at the sorts of people that the majority of the British public believe have the shoulders to bear increased taxes. But yes, if this does become, and again, it's part of the risk, the second game in town, if this budget and if this Labour government starts to get framed as rising taxes, making people pay for stuff, making everybody sort of chip in for things that they perhaps don't think is necessarily their obligation to chip in on, that's dangerous. And that could really push public opinion in a very negative direction for the Labour Party and for Rachel Reeves.
And I'll just add very briefly before we go to Chris. As things stand, I think there's only at the moment one really angry group from this budget, which is farmers. And we have seen that, which is obviously the rules on inheritance and this idea of family farms. And I don't think that is, you've had slight problems. They now have, figures like Jeremy Clarkson and Kirsty Alsop going out saying how awful it is. I think Darren Jones this morning has said, well, they're not, traditional Labour voters anyway. But there is one angry group, and the question is, does it now spread if small business owners start to, it could get worse than just that one group, because at the moment they're just, I think, the one clear loser we see, but there's time for more to come out.
Chris?
Well, I don't know, I haven't seen Darren's quote, but I mean, most of the farmers, I think, in my patch were voting for me because they felt so bloody let down by the last government and everything, all of the chaos that they caused them in their farms. Looking through the report briefly yesterday, I can't remember the exact numbers, but the vast majority of farms will be excluded from the inheritance tax because the vast majority of farms, pretty much all family farms in this country, do not meet the threshold in order to reach that, and therefore won't be affected by those changes. It's only those. Let's be blunt about it. There are a lot of very rich people in this country who use land to avoid paying inheritance tax, and that isn't acceptable. And we need to make sure that, if we've got an inheritance tax system, that rich people aren't trying to find loopholes in order to avoid paying it like everybody else is. And I think it's right that we tackle those big decisions. On businesses more generally, look, we did put mitigations in place against for small businesses on the national insurance rise. We didn't want to have to make this national insurance rise. Unfortunately, we're in a situation where we have to. There were those mitigations in place, which means that the vast majority, I think off the top of my head again, about 3/4 is being paid by, will be affecting bigger businesses rather than smaller businesses. But we also have to look at the package as a whole and everything else that we're doing to support smaller businesses. We've started the reform of business rates, particularly in the short term, looking at how we can help hospitality businesses. One of the biggest issues that's been facing small businesses that I've spoken to is energy bills. We've started the process of setting up GB Energy, of investing in creating more clean energy here in the UK, so we're no longer reliant on the whims of foreign oil and gas prices. And look, like just having a more stable economy, not doing the chaotic things that Liz Truss did. We've already passed a bill. We had a budget that the OBR had a look through beforehand, which means that we haven't seen a massive surge in interest rates and inflation as a consequence of that. Interest rates will be coming down next year. All of those things together will mean that the next 5 years will be significantly better place for small businesses than the last 5 years have been.
Thanks, Chris. I guess I just want to turn the last little bit of the discussion before we move to questions onto what was missing. The growth figures in the OBR forecast were quite low. Yeah. Can Labour do anything to turn those figures around? Who'd like to kick off? Katy?
I think Labour will try and say that, look at the supply side reform we're going to be bringing in, and there'll be some changes in that sense. So things like planning, other areas there. And I think in the past, I think that OBR didn't score some of David Cameron's labour market changes very favourably on growth, and then actually it did bring more growth than the OBR had. So are there some parallels there? It's not a direct read across, but I would just say the OBR sometimes doesn't score things very well and things can be proven differently. But I think they'll try and emphasise the supply side reforms. But I do think, given Keir Starmer and Rachel Reeves have said so many times they're a government that is going for growth, the figures that came out were a little bit damning of some of the things. Now, you clearly have a new investment pot of money to spend and the comprehensive spending review and so forth. But what is the narrative or the message of this budget? I think it's much more easy to argue that it's a budget for the workers. And it is, I had one member of Chris's intake saying to me, it's actually quite a radical generational wealth transfer from business and, businesses and the asset wealthy to workers. But the Treasury will want to say that bit out loud. and then I said, yeah, I think I could see that. But I think it's easier to argue that than to say this is the budget you would do to get those growth figures up in the forecast in the way that perhaps you would have wanted them to look at for a government going for growth. Doesn't mean you're not going to have growth, but I personally think they made a choice to go for the voter and the worker message rather than the growth message. And happy workers perhaps create growth. That's what we've heard many times in the Labour government, but it's not what the OBR is recognising.
Chris?
Yeah, I think there's probably something in Katy's point there about a sort of false negative problem, if that's the way of putting it. The OBR will have a high evidential base for measures and how they think whether they think they're going to have a positive impact on economic growth, and that's normally a very high bar that you can't clear. But actually, I think, and we know we're not going to create economic growth through one budget alone. It has to be a constant, ongoing mission with everything that we do as part of our government. It is our top #1 mission. So there are measures here which I think will be very positive for economic growth, which we've talked about, but it also has to be something that plays through all of our legislative agenda, thinking about how we can get those productivity gains, that investment back in the country again. Because the growth numbers that we've inherited are really scary. We need to get those up. We need to be thinking about how we get those up, because it's going to be really damaging to the country if we don't.
Patrick?
Yeah, I think if I was Rachel Reeves, I might have gone even harder in on this idea that this is a budget for fixing the things that aren't quite working in the country right now. I might have stood up in my first line and said, this is a budget for fixing public services, and we know exactly how and who is going to pay for it. And sort of maybe going in even harder on that framing. I think the idea sort of fixing the foundations is a bit vague, perhaps. Making sure you can get your NHS appointment is a lot more concrete. So I might have done a bit more on that in terms of land and communication strategy. Economics is not my strong point, I'll definitely admit, but one thing I was interested in leading into this budget was consumer confidence. And there was a report and a couple of articles out around it which suggested that some of the communications and the narrative and the pitch rolling that the Labour Party was doing, particularly after it sort of took power in terms of the whole goodness gracious me, the public finances are terrible, this is awful, it's all going down the pan, had a serious knock-on effect on consumer confidence. And of course, if people aren't confident and they're not spending money, then the economy, as far as I can remember my economics textbooks, suffers a little bit. So it'd be interesting, and of course that messaging did change. I think particularly around conference, we saw the speeches, the mood kind of change in that. And there's a little bit in the budget to suggest, okay, there are problems, there is some optimism here, and here are some solutions, but perhaps I might have, again, thinking about communication strategies and the knock-on effects of how people react to and behave when they hear economic news, might have maybe upped that message as well and say, we've got this, you can trust us, have confidence in us, have confidence in what we're doing, and we'll get through this.
Thanks, Patrick. I think you've had enough questions from me. It's now time to turn over to the audience. So any questions, pop your hand up, and my colleague has a mic. I think we'll probably do questions in pairs or threes if there's a couple of you. So first we've got the lady here in the face.
Hello, Tanya Bowers, Global Public Policy Director at the Association of Professional Staffing Companies. So we have 1,500 members globally, recruitment company members across the UK, Europe, Singapore and Australia. And we put people, or our members put people into professional sectors all of the sectors that are set out as critical in the growth strategy into permanent and temporary roles, and the self-employed as well. So we know how important business confidence is, and I know that's sort of been discussed.
Yeah.
So my question really is about the delivery gap. Realistically, in terms of time, how long do you think it's going to take before all of the money that they've promised into the National Wealth Fund, into GB Energy, into capital spending in the public sector is going to come down the chain so that our members and their clients will start to have the confidence to hire, to upskill and to reskill, which is all absolutely necessary to drive the growth that the government's so keen to achieve. Thank you.
Thank you. And we'll just take another question at the same time. I think it was at the end.
Hi, Max Camplin from Cavendish. I'm asking a question at our own event. I just wanted to ask the panel about productivity gains, and particularly in terms of the public sector. They've been static for the last 25 years, and growth is going to have to come through productivity gains. Just wondering what prospects we think of getting some with this big public sector spending budget.
Thanks. So who would like to kick us off? So we've got two questions, one on when will businesses be able to start investing and hiring again, and on productivity. Chris looks keen.
I want to do the productivity gains one.
I think Chris should do both.
Yeah.
And then we'll chip in.
Yeah.
Look, yes, it's very important, and particularly, and it's basically the only meaningful thing that we need to bring growth back, and what we've been really lacking over the past 14 years. I mean, the public sector in particular, and particularly in the NHS as well. I was going to respond on the reform point earlier. Like, this is a big part of what we're doing. You know, in order to get those productivity and gains in the NHS, for example, you need to be putting in. You need to not be robbing the capital budget in order for the government budget, for example. And that's one of the problems that we've been facing, and that's one of the problems that we've been trying to fix with this budget. It's also making sure that we are investing in that technology and data. So one piece of technology, for example, so much of nurses' and doctors' time is wasted being completely unproductive because they are looking for equipment to use. We can actually whack trackers on this equipment so we know where they are in the hospital buildings, and therefore they can just go and find them rather than having to waste, good chunk of their working hour trying to work out where equipment is. But in order to do that, you need well-operating Wi-Fi networks across our hospitals, which in many cases we don't have. Or you need IT systems that aren't 20 years out of date, which in most cases that we don't have. So making sure that we're putting the capital spend in for our technology, for our buildings, in order to bring apart those productivity gains. And there was a lot of money for that in the budget yesterday. It's a big part of Wes's priority. That's the kind of reforms that we need as well. We also probably need to have a bit more, right across our public sector, a bit more of our honest conversation about middle managers. Everybody is obsessed with this idea that you can just get rid of, in our police force, in all of it, that you could just get rid of middle managers and then everything will be great. There'll be loads more nurses. And of course, we all know that just works against any principle of division of labour. You get rid of middle managers and you just make your nurses middle managers as well as nurses. So we need to have an honest conversation about bringing back proper management structures, which is driven by productivity gains, not driven by politics quite often, in order to bring that about. And I used to do Patrick's job, so I'm really obsessed with the concept of data across public services. You can't do an API call between two government departments at the moment, and that's pretty insane. We need to, I think, be looking at investing a lot of money in our data infrastructure across our public services, across all levels, to make sure that we can look at how we can marry up data sets, get everything talking to each other, have a centralised data hub, maybe even look at using some sort of digital data ID system so that we can start having all of that joined up data that can help us run our public services more effectively, have a better understanding of the country that we're trying to make policy decisions about, do policy interventions a lot better and run our public services more efficiently. So I think they're some of the things that we can be thinking about to get productivity gains in our National Health Service. They're some of the, across our public services, they're some of the conversations that are happening. And I don't know the answer to you on the exact timings on the different packages, and of course it'll vary a lot on different packages, but on all of the ones that you've mentioned, GB Energy, the National Wealth Fund, they're the ones legislatively, civil servant times that we're working on setting up as quickly as possible. Because if you think of the chronology of this, we know that we need to be doing the things that get that certainty and growth in as soon as possible, because that's the thing that will, just speaking politically for a minute, if we don't get those bits done quickly, we're not going to see the returns in time for the next election. So they are the things that we are prioritising, even if I don't know the timelines off the top of my head.
I was hoping Chris had been in a meeting for you and had been told. But just picking up on his point, I mean, I think that obviously some of this takes longer, and when it comes to also assigning, there's a question as to how much is Rachel Reeves going to spend of the new, around 50 billion she can probably have for the real change, and how much is she going to show restraint, how the market's going to react, and those things to unpack. I think on GB Energy and probably Ed Miliband's department specifically, I do think it's one of the areas where they are moving the most quickly. Yeah. I think that Ed Miliband, you can tell that he has worked in government previously, and it's also a department they've come in with a very clear plan, and to the dislike of some NIMBYs, so no one on this panel, like ticking off and signing off solar plants and so forth. So and therefore I think there is a real pace on GB Energy and lots of the green investments, partly for some of the reasons Chris has said, which you have to move quickly, but also if you've been waiting 14 years to get back into government and you have a slight idea of what you're doing, you don't want to waste a day in government. So I think there is an appetite to move very fast.
Yeah, to perhaps take the Polster hat off a little bit, actually, and to answer both these questions. One, the productivity, not to sound too much like a parrot, but I think sort of technology and thinking about the ways in which different elements of government and even different institutions within the same sectors of government can start talking to each other properly and start moving sort of in more a data-driven problem solution sort of avenue is probably one of the ideas I would look at straight away. And sort of just speaking very sort of simply my own experience at YouGov, we've been sort of porting artificial intelligence into a lot of what we've been doing lately over the past year, and some of the gains that we've seen from that in terms of productivity and the power that it's unlocked for us has been incredible, and none of us are really even AI experts. So I think there's a lot of quite easy things that could be doing and a lot of technology that could be going in there that could do a lot of for a lot of solutions for you. And then to kind of comment on the GB Energy wealth and everything as well, I think timing is important, but also scale. And that's something that's really interesting me at the minute. A lot of the work we're doing with some of our clients, particularly in the energy sector and sort of in and around GB Energy, is thinking about and talking to government about and talking to the Labour Party about the scale and the ambition of the things which they are setting out, particularly, as I say, around sort of GB Energy, because it was by far probably one of Labour's most popular pre-election pledges or pre-election ideas was GB Energy, mostly because a lot of people thought it was going to be something like E.ON or British Gas, so they could just sign on to and be like, yeah, great, I can get my suppliers to change over to GB Energy. Of course, that's probably not what it's going to be, but there's a lot of room in between someone that just provides money for investment and a full-on energy supplier, and where GB Energy actually ends up landing and where a lot of these other sort of big ticket items end up coming in terms of scale, in terms of scope, I think is going to be really important, and a lot of interest is going to be paid to that.
Thank you. Right, we've got time for some extra questions. Has anyone got one? Right, so we've got one at the front here, and then I could probably do all three of you together, actually. So.
Hi, Rod Selby from Anchor, which is housing and care for those in later life. There was no mention of social care in the budget. Does the panel think that even with all the massive investment in the NHS, reform is going to achieve anything without an associated reform of the social care system?
Thank you. And just in front of you.
Yeah, I wanted to ask about communication strategy and whether you think it had been a success so far in terms of really ramping up the inheritance, and then also the fact that it's been such a tax-raising budget and yet markets haven't responded overly negatively, and the general mood doesn't, well, I don't know what you think the general mood is, but doesn't seem to be overly negative about that. So is that a success for communication strategy for Labour?
Thank you. And then this third one over here, just pass that. Thank you.
Hello, Nicola Pitts from the Independent Networks Association. I sort of feel that everybody's been holding their breath, waiting for the budget, and hopefully this will then start to sort of get more progress on policy. I was interested in how pragmatic you think the government will be going forwards around chasing things like growth and productivity. I've got a bit of a vested interest in here. My members connect up about 80% of new housing to their utilities, and there's a lot, housing has had a big slowdown, and there's a lot that were due to be connected with gas networks, whether or not the future home standard will allow that to happen. But it is about 3.5 years worth of housing growth. So will they be able to make pragmatic decisions on these things going forwards?
Okay, thank you. Just pop the mic back. So 3 different questions. First on the comms strategy and whether my former colleagues are doing a good job, and on social care and social care funding, and on decision making to get going with these projects. Anyone want to kick us off?
Go on, Katy.
Katy, Katy, why don't you give us a view on the comms strategy?
What do I think of the government comms? Well, it's not been going great, has it? I mean, Keir Starmer's had the sharpest fall in personal approving ratings of any Prime Minister for the past 40 years. So I just mean objectively, it's been quite a tricky over 100 days now. And I don't think even the most loyal stormtroopers, if you spoke to them privately, would say they think it's been a great success. Instead, there's lots who say there's still time to turn it around. I don't think there's sheer panic in government or in 10 Downing Street, but I think there is an acknowledgement mistakes have been made. And of course, you've also seen some senior departures from 10 Downing Street through Sue Gray. And lots of people saying, oh, now things work better. But I don't think you can blame all the problems on one woman. And clearly that there have been various issues. On the communications, I think that, to get to the budget point on the comms, you have to look at the comms that came before. And I think that there has been an issue whereby one of the things Labour did really well in opposition was to stack their grid of news. So particularly when it was things like recess, they always had a story, used to drive the Tories a bit mad, and they always had things to say. And understandably, that I think Labour were quite tired after a really long election campaign. And the summer was not a grid full of news, which meant that the lobby, as we tend to do, wrote endless stories about Morgan versus Sue, focused on freebies. People got quite defensive. And it became lots of things that I think perhaps would have been page 10 became much bigger because there was less being said. But I think there's now a bit of a corrective going on. You have a boosted number 10. You now have a head of strategic communications. James Lyons has joined. He was at the Sunday Times. Then he worked for the NHS. Now he's in number 10. And I think there is more thinking through the announcements they want to get there. Now, it's never going to be perfect. There's a reason the thick of it existed and was very popular. All governments will have gaffes. And I don't think, the working people in advance of this budget, it's a prime example of, was there a clear line on what a working person was, rather than it seemed on a different day-to-day basis offending small groups in the country who felt as though maybe they did get up in the morning and do something that resembled work, only they weren't. So I think it's not been completely smooth sailing, but to the point about this budget, I think there's been a lot of misery in advance of it, which has not been polling so well. But I think Rachel's delivery yesterday, the Chancellor was very confident. And it does feel as though there is a clearer narrative to get out there, and it's a learning process. So I think it's been bad. I think that but I think the good thing is there is acknowledgement of that, and you do get the sense that the team are learning from some of their mistakes, and there is a clearer sense going forward.
Chris, would you like to touch on the other questions on social care?
Yeah.
And the decision making to get going on projects?
Yeah, I mean, as what did you say? The most loyal stormtrooper, one of the most,
even the most loyal stormtroopers.
as one of the most loyal stormtroopers.
Top 5.
As one of the most loyal stormtroopers, I do think. I mean, the thing is, transitioning from opposition to government is always a tricky process. I mean, I got a new job recently, and you do spend a lot of your time just trying to sort of set things up and work out where you're going, and that does sometimes get in the way of things like making sure that your comms is optimum, and that sort of thing does take time. And then having a summer thrown in the middle makes things a little bit more difficult. So I think what's more important is that we get the comms into a much better place than it's been. And I think this budget has been a real turning point for that. And, you know, I've got the best front page response to a budget in history today. But actually, the consensus around here is that the comms has been done well. We're moving back into a better place on that. And I think that's really important. On social care, I do take your point. Fixing social care in this country is incredibly important. We are not going to get the NHS back into a good place unless we also have a plan in order to fix social care. And we are going to be talking a lot more about that in the coming years because we really do understand and appreciate the significance of it. Yes, I think that there is a feeling that we do need to be a lot more pragmatic on these things. The future home standards are a really good example, actually, of how we need to appreciate much more pragmatic policy making, because there's a clear trade-off there. If you ask for too much, you end up killing off a house building industry right now. If you ask for too little, we're going to end up building a load of homes that we need to retrofit in the not too distant future. So working out a trade-off through that. I mean, my broad view on that one, for example, is we should be far more ambitious on what we're asking for on the future home standard, but we should make sure that the lead-in times are long enough for the market to be able to deal with it. And it's one of those key examples as well where you can be pragmatic, but also ambitious, but also make sure that you're providing certainty to the market, because you're not going, we haven't told you yet, but we're going to be bringing new standards in next year. What kind of standards can we be thinking about in 5 years, and what kind of certainty can we give you and everybody else to be working towards that? And we're not always going to get it perfect, but a policy making that is approaching that in a place of pragmatism, that is going, this might not always be the best politics, but we're willing to sort of battle through those decisions because we know that bringing growth and investment back into the economy is far more important for us politically. Patrick will tell you, the most important, if you look at all of the political science around the world, the most important variable that works out whether a government gets re-elected is whether people have got more money in their pocket at the end of 5 years than they do now. That's basically it. And two, we've had a government that basically has sort of got obsessed with the day-to-day news cycle and what might poll well or badly or sound good in a focus group, and forgotten that mission, whereas we've now got 5 years where we can think far more about that mission of getting more money into the pay packets and knowing that we'll win re-election if we do so, and therefore being far more pragmatic about some of these difficult policy areas is something that we're far more able and willing to do.
Patrick, I'm going to give you the final word.
Yeah, absolutely correct. If a populace, if a voting public feel that they're better off after 4 or 5 years of a government than they did when they first came in, that's an incredibly strong predictor that an incumbent is going to do well. Absolutely the case. I'll focus pretty much all of my final words on the comms thing because it's my favourite. And it's what I can actually speak to with a bit of authority. You mentioned the inheritance, and I think that's a kind of an underplayed point. That particular part of the comms strategy, I think, was done very, very well. And if you poll, and as we have done, on sort of who owns the sort of economic problems or who's responsible for the situation that the government now find themselves in, you get an incredibly clear response from the public saying that it is the Conservative government who own this, and they pin it on various actors, including Liz Truss, who I think just about beats Keir Starmer on the tanking ratings. But sort of,
I think it's since winning an election.
Yes, that definitely
Which Liz
is the
did not
case.
do.
No. So that was done very successfully. Now, I think that then got over-egged, and then we had combinations of, as sort of Chris kind of touched on, the Labour Party finding out how to do government in kind of a quite public way, and having the stories around the donations, what have you, and there was a bit of a sense that coming through from the public when we started talking to them, particularly asking them in their own words, that, they talked about change all the time, but all I hear is problems and them looking like they're just doing the stuff that the government were doing before. And I think that got them into a tricky place. I do think that has changed, and I do think the budget has sort of signalled a bit of a shift away from that. Whether or not that has or will successfully land, let's wait and see over the coming sort of days and weeks. I think Katy said at the very top. One thing that we've asked overnight, which I'm dying to see the results for, is we use our cool little AI buddy again to ask people what the main thing they've taken away from the budget was, if anything. I'm expecting like 40% of people to say nothing. But, is it tax? Is that the thing that cuts through? Or is it more money for the NHS. And I think I sort of go right back to my sort of first answer. Those are the two games in town, and whether or not this comm strategy, this government strategy, the way that they frame this has been successful, I think it's going to come down to which of those two things the public associate this budget with.
Thank you. Well, that's all we've got time for. Thank you for coming today. I just wanted to give a shout out to the little cards that are on your chairs. They've got a QR code that links to another piece of analysis that Cavendish have put out this week. It's a guide to who's who in number 10. So if you're interested in finding a bit more about the different special advisors. Pardon?
Have you updated it?
Well, Sue's not on it, no. So if you want to find out a bit more about the different government special advisors, scan the QR code and it will link to our report there. So thank you for coming and see you all soon. Have a good day.